The telephone rang at Hucknall Aerodrome on an April morning in 1942, and Ronnie Harker picked it up without knowing he was about to change the course of the war. On the other end was Wing Commander Ian Campbell Ord, commanding the RAF's Air Fighting Development Unit at Duxford, and his voice carried the particular excitement of a man who has just discovered something he cannot quite explain. They had a new American fighter sitting on the tarmac, he said, a North American Mustang. Would Harker care to come down and fly it? Harker was Rolls-Royce's senior liaison test pilot, a quiet, precise man who had joined the company as an engineering apprentice in 1925 and learned to fly at the Newcastle Flying Club 2 years later because a trip to the Hendon Air Display had stirred something in him that engine blueprints alone could not satisfy. He was not the kind of pilot who performed for crowds. He was the kind who noticed things: a tremor in the airframe at a specific altitude, a hesitation in the throttle response that meant the supercharger was struggling, the exact moment when an engine began to give up its authority over the air. He drove to Duxford and climbed into the Mustang. For 30 minutes he threw the aircraft around the sky over Cambridgeshire. At low altitude, below 15,000 feet, the airplane was extraordinary. It was 30 miles per hour faster than a Spitfire Mk5 at 5,000 feet. The laminar flow wing, designed by Edgar Schmood at North American's plant in Inglewood, California, sliced through the air with an efficiency that felt almost unfair. The cooling system, tucked beneath the fuselage in a low-drag radiator scoop, generated so little resistance that on some days it actually produced a small amount of thrust from the heated exhaust air, a trick of thermodynamics that the Spitfire's designers could only envy. But above 15,000 feet, the Mustang died. Not literally. The Allison V1710 engine kept running, but its power bled away with every 1,000 feet of altitude gained, and by 20,000 feet, the airplane that had been a predator at treetop level became prey. The single-stage supercharger on the Allison could not compress enough air into the cylinders to maintain combustion at the altitudes where the war was actually being fought. At 30,000 feet, where the bombers flew and the German fighters waited, the Mustang was useless. Harker landed, walked to his office, and on the 1st of May 1942 sat down with pen and paper. He wrote a memo that would become one of the most consequential documents in aviation history. The Mustang, he wrote, closely resembled the Messerschmitt 109F. With a powerful engine, specifically a Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 with its two-stage, two-speed supercharger, its performance could be outstanding, since it was already 35 miles per hour faster than the Spitfire V at roughly the same power. What Harker was proposing sounded simple. Take out the American engine, put in the British one. But nothing about what followed would be simple at all. The problem was physics, and the physics was unforgiving. The Allison V1710 was not a bad engine. It displaced 1,710 cubic inches. Each of its 12 cylinders held roughly as much volume as the entire engine of a small automobile, and at sea level it produced around 1,150 horsepower. At the altitudes where the RAF used the Mustang for ground attack and tactical reconnaissance, it performed admirably. The Mustang Mk1 squadrons had destroyed or damaged 200 locomotives, over 200 canal barges, and an unknown number of parked enemy aircraft in their first 18 months of low-level rhubarb raids across occupied France, losing only 8 aircraft. But the air war over Europe was not being fought at treetop level. It was being fought at 25,000, 30,000, sometimes 35,000 feet, the rarefied altitudes where the 8th Air Force's B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were attempting to bomb Germany into submission during daylight hours. At those heights, the atmosphere contains barely a third of the oxygen available at sea level. A conventional engine, breathing through a single-stage supercharger, simply cannot force enough air-fuel mixture into the cylinders to maintain full power. The Allison's output dropped off so steeply above 15,000 feet that it lost roughly half its horsepower by the time it reached 25,000. The Merlin 61 solved this with an elegant and brutally effective piece of engineering, a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. The first impeller compressed the incoming air. The second impeller compressed it again. Between the two stages, an intercooler, essentially a small radiator packed with ethylene glycol, chilled the compressed air back down because hot air expands and carries less oxygen per cubic inch. The result was an engine that could maintain 1,270 horsepower above 30,000 feet. At an altitude where the Allison was gasping, the Merlin was breathing easily. The difference was not incremental, it was transformative. The Mustang X, the first experimental Merlin-engined Mustang converted at Rolls-Royce's Hucknall facility, reached 433 miles per hour at 22,000 feet, with an absolute ceiling above 40,000 feet. The Allison-powered Mustang topped out around 390 miles per hour and was effectively useless above 25,000 feet. Same airframe, different engine, two completely different airplanes. But acknowledging that the Mustang needed the Merlin and actually producing enough Merlins to put in it were two entirely different problems, separated by an ocean, a war, and a manufacturing philosophy that the two nations did not share. Rolls-Royce could not spare the engines. Every Merlin rolling off the production lines at Derby, Crewe, and the Shadow Factory in Glasgow was already spoken for. The Spitfire needed them. The Lancaster, which itself existed only because Harker had earlier suggested replacing the disastrous Rolls-Royce Vulture engines on the Avro Manchester with 4 Merlins, consumed them in enormous quantities, 4 per aircraft. The Mosquito took 2. The Hurricane took 1. There was no surplus. There was barely enough. The British had known for years that they needed Merlin production outside the reach of the Luftwaffe's bombers. As early as 1940, Rolls-Royce had approached American automobile manufacturers to license the design. The first choice had been Ford. In mid-1940, through the efforts of Edsel Ford, an agreement was reached for Ford to build 9,000 Merlins, 6,000 for Britain, 3,000 for the American Armed Forces. Rolls-Royce blueprints and a sample engine were shipped across the Atlantic. Ford engineers in Dearborn began duplicating the drawings, microfilming them, producing prototype crankshafts within 2 weeks, cast rather than forged, but in the correct material. The momentum was extraordinary. And then Henry Ford killed it. The elder Ford, who controlled the company's board despite his son's presidency, refused to build engines that would be sent to a foreign power engaged in a conflict. He would manufacture only for American defense. The contract was canceled. The blueprints were boxed up. The prototype parts were shelved. The irony was exquisite and bitter. Ford of Britain at Trafford Park near Manchester would ultimately produce over 30,000 Merlins during the war, employing 17,000 workers in a factory that never stopped running. But Ford of America, under the iron will of its founder, would build B-24 Liberators and Jeeps and tank engines and practically everything else the arsenal of democracy could dream up, but not a single Merlin. Into this void stepped the Packard Motor Car Company of Detroit, Michigan. And here, the story becomes something larger than aviation. It becomes a story about what happens when a nation's finest precision manufacturer, a company that had spent 40 years building the most meticulously engineered luxury automobiles in America, turns its entire industrial existence toward building someone else's engine in someone else's measurement system to someone else's specifications, under the crushing weight of a war that could not wait. Packard was founded in Warren, Ohio in 1899 by James Ward Packard, a mechanical engineer who believed he could build a better car than the Winton machines his business partner owned. He was right. By the time the company moved to Detroit in 1903 and opened a factory designed by Albert Kahn, one of the first industrial buildings in America to use reinforced concrete, Packard automobiles were already synonymous with engineering perfection. The factory on East Grand Boulevard would eventually sprawl across 40 acres and contained 3.5 million square feet of floor space. At its peak, it employed over 40,000 workers practicing more than 80 skilled trades. The company's motto was simple: ask the man who owns one. Nobody who owned a Packard needed to be told what they had. But Packard was also, crucially, an aero engine company. During the First World War, the company had produced the Liberty V-12, a standardized aircraft engine designed by Packard's own Colonel Jesse V. Vincent, working alongside E.J. Hall of the Hall-Scott Motor Company. Vincent had sketched the initial design in a hotel room in Washington over the course of a single weekend. The Liberty engine powered American and Allied aircraft throughout 1918 and remained in service for years after the armistice. When Lord Beaverbrook's emissaries came calling in the summer of 1940, offering Packard an initial order of 6,000 Merlins, with Britain paying for the new plant and machine tools, Vincent was still at his desk at Packard as Vice President of Engineering. He was older now, but no less relentless. The contract was signed on September 3, 1940, $130 million, the equivalent of roughly $3 billion in today's currency. Packard would build the Merlin. But first, Packard would have to understand the Merlin. And that understanding would require tearing apart not just an engine, but an entire way of thinking about how machines are made. The Merlin arrived in Detroit accompanied by Rolls-Royce engineers and approximately 14,000 individual parts. It also arrived with drawings, thousands of them, rendered in a system of measurement and tolerancing that bore almost no resemblance to what Packard's engineers used. The problems began immediately and compounded geometrically. First, the measurement systems were incompatible. Britain used imperial measurements, but not the same imperial system that America used. Rolls-Royce specified dimensions in thousandths of an inch, but their baseline standards grew from a British engineering tradition that predated true standardization. Converting these figures to American specifications was not simple arithmetic. It required understanding the intent behind every tolerance, what the designer actually needed the part to do, not merely what number he had written down. Second, the British standard Whitworth thread system. Every bolt, every nut, every threaded connection on the Merlin used a 55-degree angle thread form with radiused roots and crests. American unified threads used a 60-degree angle with flat roots. The two systems were completely incompatible. Every single fastener on the engine, and there were thousands, would have to be manufactured in-house using British specifications with tooling that no American supplier stocked. Third, and this was the revelation that stunned the Rolls-Royce engineers when they arrived in Detroit, the tolerances on the Merlin drawings were, by Packard standards, too loose. Sir Stanley Hooker, the brilliant Rolls-Royce supercharger designer, would later recount the moment in his memoir. A Ford engineer, working on the parallel British Merlin program at Trafford Park, had appeared in the office Hooker shared with Cyril Lovesey and announced that Ford could not build the Merlin to the drawings provided. Hooker, assuming the tolerances were too tight for mass production, replied with what he admitted was lofty condescension. The Ford engineer corrected him. The tolerances were far too wide. Ford made motorcar engines to much closer precision than this because every part on a Ford engine had to be interchangeable with the same part on any other engine. That was the only way mass production worked. Packard faced the identical problem. Rolls-Royce's manufacturing philosophy relied on highly trained fitters, skilled craftsmen who filed, adjusted, and hand-fitted each part during assembly. If a connecting rod did not quite match the crankshaft, a worker modified it until it did. Bearing clearances were individually adjusted. Cylinder heads were matched to specific blocks. Supercharger impellers were balanced by hand. Each Merlin was, in effect, a unique creation. Art as much as engineering. And it was art that Britain could not produce fast enough. Packard's philosophy was the opposite. American automotive production demanded perfect interchangeability. Any crankshaft had to fit any block. Any connecting rod had to match any crankshaft. No filing, no fitting, no skilled artisan making a judgment call about clearance. The parts came off the machine tools ready to assemble, or they were rejected. Jesse Vincent and his team of over 200 engineers and draftsmen spent the better part of a year completely redrawing every Merlin blueprint to Packard's own standards, tightening tolerances, converting thread specifications, redesigning the cylinder block from a single-piece casting to a two-piece construction that was more suitable for mass production. The strain of this transatlantic engineering collaboration was not abstract. Of the two original Rolls-Royce liaison engineers sent to work at the Packard plant in Detroit, one, T.B. Barrington, the chief designer, died during his tenure in America. The other, J. Eller, the chief experimental engineer, perished soon after his return to England. Stanley Hooker would later write that they bore such a crushing load that it killed them both. On August 2, 1941, inside Packard's East Grand Boulevard plant, two Merlin engines built entirely from American-made parts thundered to life on test stands. A crowd of engineers, military officials, and Packard executives watched as the engines roared and the needles on the gauges climbed to the numbers that Rolls-Royce had specified. The engines met spec. They ran. They were, by every measurable standard, Merlins. But they were also something new. The crankshaft journals were ground to tolerances that would have astonished the fitters at Derby. The supercharger components were machined with a precision that left clearances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, the thickness of a human hair divided by 4. The two-piece cylinder blocks, Packard's own innovation, made casting and machining faster without sacrificing strength. The Bendix injection carburetor replaced the British SU unit using American unified threads on a component that otherwise conformed entirely to British specifications. Every Whitworth threaded fastener on the rest of the engine had been faithfully replicated by Packard's own tooling shops. The first production engines were designated V-1651, the American military's designation, or Merlin 28 when supplied to the RAF. These were single-stage, two-speed supercharged engines equivalent to the Merlin XX. They were good engines, destined for P-40F Warhawks and for British Lancasters and Mosquitoes. But they were not yet the engine that would transform the Mustang. That engine, the two-stage, two-speed supercharged V-1653, equivalent to the Merlin 61, would come next, and it would require Packard to master what was arguably the most complex piece of precision machinery being mass-produced anywhere in the world in 1942. Full production began in 1942, and the scale of what Packard achieved defies casual comprehension. The factory on East Grand Boulevard grew to nearly 4.5 million square feet. 41,000 workers, men and women, skilled and unskilled, many of whom had never touched a machine tool before the war, assembled engines on production lines that ran around the clock. New employees attended Packard's induction school, where coordinators like Holly Crowder taught them the basics of factory procedure, from how to punch a time card to how to handle the precision components they would be building. Women workers became essential, not merely in support roles, but on the assembly lines, operating the lathes and grinders and measuring instruments that turned raw metal into engine components. The smell of that factory is gone now, but the men and women who worked there remembered it for the rest of their lives. Cutting oil and hot metal and the acrid tang of glycol coolant, the sharp chemical bite of zyglopenetrant, the fluorescent dye used to inspect crankshafts and connecting rods for microscopic cracks that could become catastrophic fractures at altitude. The smell of fresh lumber from the crating department, where finished engines were packed for shipment. The smell of sweat and coffee and the canteen's wartime meals, eaten in 15-minute breaks between shifts that ran 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours. The sound was a continuous industrial roar. Air wrenches and grinding wheels and the heavy thump of drop forging presses, punctuated at intervals by the scream of a completed engine being run up to full power on the test stand. The test cells were separated from the main factory floor by thick concrete walls, but the vibration carried through the building like a heartbeat. You could feel a Merlin running at 3,000 RPM from the soles of your shoes from 100 yards away. Each engine ran for hours before it was accepted. Each one had to prove itself, had to demonstrate that it could hold full power, hold oil pressure, hold coolant temperature within specification, before it was crated in lumber and shipped by truck or rail to an airframe factory in Inglewood, California, or Dallas, Texas. The workers on those lines came from everywhere. Former Packard automobile assemblers who understood precision but had never worked on an aircraft engine. Farm boys from Michigan and Ohio who had driven tractors before they learned to operate turret lathes. Women, thousands of them, who became indispensable not because the work was easy, but because they proved they could do it with the patience and exactness the job demanded. Their hands assembled the supercharger impellers, their eyes checked the gauges, their judgment accepted or rejected parts that would eventually fly over occupied Europe in the noses of fighter planes. The photographs from the National WWI-2 Museum's collection show them clearly. Women in coveralls and hairnets seated at workbenches under fluorescent lights, holding micrometers and ring gauges with the casual competence of people who have done this 10,000 times and will do it 10,000 more. By war's end, Packard had built 55,523 Merlin engines. In 1943, production reached 15,084. In 1944, it climbed to 22,969. Continental Motors built another small batch. The total American Merlin production exceeded 58,000 units, and every single one of them used British Whitworth threads on its critical fasteners, manufactured in Detroit by a luxury car company that had voluntarily abandoned its own products for the duration. The first XP-51B, the prototype Merlin Mustang, powered by a Packard V1650-3, flew on November 30, 1942, with North American test pilot Bob Chilton at the controls. The flight lasted 45 minutes. It did not go perfectly. A chemical reaction between different metals in the cooling system and the glycol coolant was clogging the radiator. A new radiator design and scoop were fitted to the second prototype, which resolved the problem. But even before the prototypes flew, the USAAF had already placed an order. In August 1942, 3 months before a single Merlin Mustang had left the ground, the Army Air Forces contracted for 400 P-51B airframes. The brass had seen the British test data from the Mustang X program. They had read Harker's reports. They had listened to Thomas Hitchcock, the American Assistant Air Attaché in London, a man who in civilian life had been one of the most famous polo players in the world and a friend of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who had loosely modeled Tom Buchanan in The Great Gatsby on him. Hitchcock had lobbied relentlessly for the Merlin Mustang, sending detailed reports to General Henry Hap Arnold about the test results. Hitchcock understood, with a clarity that many senior officers lacked, that the daylight bombing campaign over Europe was failing because the bombers had no fighter that could escort them all the way to the target and back. Production P-51Bs began rolling off North American's Inglewood, California line in June 1943. A second line opened at a new plant in Dallas, Texas, producing the essentially identical P-51C. The Packard V1650-3 gave the Mustang a top speed of roughly 440 miles per hour at 28,000 feet, 50 miles per hour faster than the Allison-powered version, and a service ceiling above 40,000 feet. The two-stage supercharger maintained power at the altitudes where the bombers flew and the German fighters attacked. But it was the range that changed the war. The Merlin Mustang, with external drop tanks, could escort bombers over 1,600 miles, from England to Berlin and back, with fuel to spare for combat. The 4th Fighter Group, stationed at Debden, 40 miles north of London, received their P-51Bs on February 28, 1944. Colonel Donald Blakesley, their commanding officer, had the planes ready for operational flying the next day. Some pilots took off with less than an hour's checkout in the new type. 4 days later, on March 4th, they escorted B-17s and B-24s to Berlin. It was the first time single-engine fighters had made the 1,100-mile round trip. Consider what that meant. For over a year, the 8th Air Force had been sending heavy bombers deep into Germany with fighter escorts that could accompany them only part way. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a magnificent aircraft in its own right, powered by Pratt & Whitney's massive R-2800 radio, simply did not have the fuel to reach Berlin. Complex relay arrangements were devised, with P-47s handing off to P-38 Lightnings and back again, but there was always a gap, a stretch of sky over central Germany where the bombers flew alone and the Luftwaffe's fighters, who had patiently waited for the escorts to turn back, tore into them. The losses were catastrophic. On October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17s in a single raid on Schweinfurt. 60 bombers, 600 men killed or captured in an afternoon. Deep penetration raids were suspended until a long-range escort could be found. The Mustang was that escort. Colonel Clarence Bud Anderson, a triple ace with the 357th Fighter Group, the first P-51 unit assigned to the 8th Air Force, remembered that the Mustang went like hell because the Merlin had power to spare at any altitude thanks to its two-stage supercharger. His average combat mission lasted 4.5 hours. His longest, on D-Day, ran 6 hours and 55 minutes, and he landed with fuel for another hour of flying. The Merlin Mustang got roughly 3.3 miles per gallon, while the P-47 managed less than 1.8. Same mission, same sky, twice the range. Major George Preddy, the highest-scoring P-51 ace of the war, flew with the 352nd Fighter Group out of Bodny. On one mission to Berlin, a maximum-effort escort in conditions of unlimited visibility, Preddy and his squadron encountered 30 Messerschmitt Bf-109s attacking the B-17 formation they were protecting. The German fighters had not noticed the Mustangs. Preddy led his attack from behind, opening fire on an interceptor and apparently killing the pilot. The burning aircraft spun earthward without a parachute. In the minutes that followed, Preddy shot down 5 more, 6 victories in a single engagement. He landed at Bodny visibly ill, climbing from his vomit-spattered cockpit while a combat photographer captured the image for posterity. The engine that carried him through that fight, that held together through violent maneuvering at 30,000 feet, that maintained full power through diving and climbing and sustained high G turns, was a Packard V1650, built in Detroit by workers who would never know his name. Preddy was killed on Christmas Day 1944, shot down by friendly anti-aircraft fire while pursuing a German fighter at low altitude over Belgium. He was 25 years old. The engine that had carried him faithfully through months of combat, that had held together through dives that pegged the airspeed indicator past 500 miles per hour, through sustained turns that pressed 6 times the force of gravity into his body, was still running when he went in. The Merlin did not fail George Preddy. It never got the chance. Major James Howard, flying with the 354th Fighter Group, earned the Medal of Honor for a single mission near Oschersleben on January 11, 1944. Flying his P-51B, nicknamed Ding Hao, Howard found himself alone against a formation of German interceptors attacking the bomber stream he was escorting. He shot down 3, possibly 4, and continued to defend the bombers even after some of his guns jammed and his fuel supply grew dangerously low. For more than 30 minutes, a single Mustang, powered by a single Packard Merlin, held off an entire German fighter formation. The bomber crews he protected watched in disbelief as one airplane did the work of a squadron. These were not isolated episodes of heroism. They were the predictable consequences of an aircraft that could fly farther, climb higher, and fight longer than anything the enemy could put in the air against it. And at the heart of that aircraft, literally, physically, bolted to the engine mount behind the propeller, was a 27-liter V12 engine designed in Derby, reborn in Detroit, and tested over the burning cities of the Third Reich.
The German situation offered a stark contrast, and understanding it illuminates what the Allies possessed and the Axis did not. Germany's primary fighter engine, the Daimler-Benz DB605, which powered the Messerschmitt Bf-109G, displaced 35.7 liters compared to the Merlin's 27. The German engine was physically larger, yet in 1942 it produced comparable or only marginally greater power. It used fuel injection rather than a carburetor, which gave it an advantage in negative G maneuvers. A German pilot could push over into a dive without the engine cutting out, while early Merlin-equipped Spitfires had to half-roll first.
But the DB605 suffered from problems the Merlin never did. The bearing design was troublesome from the start. Daimler-Benz had switched from ball bearings to plain bearings, and when combined with increasingly degraded lubricants, Germany's access to high-quality base oils was shrinking every month. The result was chronic low oil pressure, engine fires, and catastrophic failures. The RLM, Germany's air ministry, considered the DB605 a sick engine. Restrictions on emergency power settings remained in place for nearly 2 years after the engine entered production. German pilots were forbidden from using full combat power in an engine that was supposed to save their lives. Materials shortages made everything worse. Critical alloying elements, nickel, cobalt, chromium, grew scarce as Allied bombing disrupted supply chains and the Eastern Front consumed resources. Exhaust valve nickel content dropped from 13.5% to 8%. The valves corroded, they scaled, they failed. The engine that was supposed to fight the Merlin could barely survive its own combustion chambers. Germany produced roughly 42,400 DB605s of all variants during the war, a formidable number. But the attrition rate was devastating. German fighter engines that struggled to reach 50 hours before overhaul faced Packard Merlins designed for reliability and built with the interchangeable precision that made field maintenance practical. An American crew chief could replace a failed component with a part from any other Merlin engine in the theater. A German mechanic often could not, because the parts had been individually fitted at the factory. This was the asymmetry that decided the air war. Not just superior aircraft, but superior engines, produced in quantities that Germany could not match, to standards of consistency that Germany's crumbling industrial base could not maintain.
In the month of March 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 511 fighter pilots killed, roughly 22% of its available force. In April, another 447 were killed, eliminating another 20%. These were experienced pilots, men who could not be replaced by the hastily trained recruits that the German training system, itself starved of fuel, was producing. By the end of April 1944, the Luftwaffe had virtually ceased offensive operations over Western Europe. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, would later testify at Nuremberg that when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the jig was up. The statement has been quoted so many times that it has become almost a cliché, but it deserves to be taken seriously. What Göring was admitting was not that a single type of aircraft had defeated him. He was admitting that the industrial system behind that aircraft, the system that took a British engine designed for hand building by craftsmen and turned it into a mass-produced power plant manufactured in a Detroit luxury car factory by workers who had never built an airplane engine before, was something that Germany could not overcome. The American and British systems had found each other. The airframe from Inglewood, the engine from Derby, reborn in Detroit, the fuel from Texas and the Caribbean, refined to 100 and eventually 150 octane. The pilots from farms and cities across America, trained in a system that produced them faster than they were lost. By D-Day, the combined bomber offensive had broken the Luftwaffe. P-51 Mustangs of the 8th Air Force destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft in the European theater, more than any other American fighter type. In the Pacific, Mustangs flew from Iwo Jima to escort B-29 superfortresses over the Japanese home islands. The Tuskegee Airmen of the 332nd Fighter Group, the Red Tails, flew P-51s on escort missions over Italy, completing more than 15,000 sorties. Approximately 15,000 Mustangs were built during the war, of which over 8,000 were P-51D models, the definitive version, with its bubble canopy and 6.5 caliber Browning machine guns, powered by the Packard V1650-7, which produced 1,695 horsepower at 3,000 RPM. After the war, Packard went home. The company that had saved the daylight bombing campaign, that had built the engine of the aircraft that broke the Luftwaffe, returned to making automobiles.
The modern assembly line that Packard had invested millions of dollars into before the war had been hastily removed in 1942 and put into storage while the factory was retooled for Merlins. Now the process reversed. The engine test stands were torn out. The precision grinding machines were sold or mothballed. The workers who had spent 4 years building the most sophisticated aircraft engine in the American arsenal went back to building sedans. It should have been a triumph. It was, instead, the beginning of the end. Despite receiving over $1 billion in government contracts during the war, Packard had earned a mere $17.5 million in profit over 5 years because of wartime price controls designed to prevent profiteering. The company emerged from the war with its reputation intact, but its finances strained and its product line frozen in 1942. Cadillac and Lincoln had invested heavily in post-war designs. Packard had invested in Merlins. The company's decline was slow and then sudden. The post-war Packards were dismissed as bathtubs. One model earned the nickname the Pregnant Elephant. The brand that had been the Rolls-Royce of America diluted itself by chasing the mid-price market, competing with Buick and Oldsmobile instead of Cadillac. In 1954, desperate for scale, Packard merged with Studebaker, a union that one industry veteran described as two drunks helping each other across the road. The Detroit plant closed in 1956. The last car bearing the Packard name rolled off a Studebaker assembly line in South Bend, Indiana in 1958. Today, the Packard factory on East Grand Boulevard is a ruin. 3.5 million square feet of reinforced concrete, designed by Albert Kahn, standing open to the weather on Detroit's east side. Building 22, where the Merlin engines were actually assembled, where 41,000 workers once built the power plants that swept the skies of Europe clear, was purchased in 2014 by an event production company for $750,000. The rest of the complex has been slowly demolished, parceled off, fought over in tax auctions and bankruptcy courts. In 2013, the entire 40-acre site sold for $405,000, less than the price of a modest house in many American cities, less than the cost of 7 Merlin engines at wartime prices.
There is a photograph, or rather there are many photographs, over 1,300 of them, preserved in the National WWII Museum's digital collection, taken inside the Packard plant during the war by photographers including Bernard Hoffman of Life magazine. In the photographs, you can see the engines taking shape on the assembly line. You can see the women workers, Holly Crowder addressing new employees in the induction classroom, Marion Lambert teaching Lucille Kazimer how to punch a time card, rows of women in coveralls operating precision lathes under fluorescent lights. You can see General James Doolittle, hero of the Tokyo raid, commander of the 8th Air Force, the man who unleashed the Mustangs, inspecting a finished Merlin on the factory floor, his hand resting on the supercharger housing as if touching something sacred. In those photographs, the factory is clean, bright, purposeful. The engines gleam. The workers look tired but certain. They know what they are building. They may not know the names of the pilots who will fly behind their engines, Preddy, Anderson, Blakesley, the men and women of the Red Tails, but they know that the work matters, that the tolerances matter, that the difference between an engine that holds together over Berlin and one that does not is the difference between an engine that holds together over Berlin and one that does not. Ronnie Harker, the quiet test pilot who picked up a telephone at Hucknall and changed the war, died in 1999 at the age of 90. Jesse Vincent, the MUI engineer who had designed the Liberty engine in a hotel room in 1917 and then spent the years of a Second World War teaching an American factory to think in Whitworth threads, lived long enough to see the company he had devoted his career to begin its decline. The Merlin engines they helped create, some 168,000 of them, built by Rolls-Royce, Ford of Britain, Packard, and Continental, powered Hurricanes and Spitfires and Lancasters and Mosquitoes and Mustangs across every theater of the war. They powered the victory. And the factory that built them is rubble now. But the engines survive, in museums, in private collections, in the handful of restored Mustangs that still fly at air shows, their Packard Merlins turning over at 3,000 RPM with a sound that no one who has heard it ever forgets.
It is not a roar exactly, and not a howl. It is a deep, sustained harmonic thunder. 12 cylinders, 27 liters, 1,649 cubic inches of displacement that seems to vibrate in the chest rather than the ears. It is the sound of a luxury car company that went to war and won and came home and died. Some sounds outlast the machines that make them. Some machines outlast the companies that built them. And some stories about a test pilot's telephone call and a memo written on a May morning and a factory in Detroit where women ground crankshafts to tolerances that the most prestigious engine maker in the world had not thought to demand outlast everything.